Where there's thunder, there's lightning. John Nada. Occasionally, while you're watching your regularly broadcasted program, you can see the static break through, and that, of course, is the truth making inroads and occasionally breaking through to the masses. Now, many people question whether or not MGTOW has any legitimate points. Many people question the hypergamy thing, the gynocentrism piece. But every once in a while, in the mainstream, we see a glimpse of the reality of the world that we live in. We see smatterings of what the MGTOW have been saying all along. These are things such as the Dustin Toth situation, which many of y'all can go and look up the details as it relates to a lot of these things that I'm about to mention. So I'm just going to briefly mention these few things. The Dustin Toth situation, where he was an acquaintance of this woman, Catherine Bennett, and they had had consensual sex at some point while they were hanging out. And it turns out that Catherine Bennett lied about him having kidnapped and raped her. But he still suffered the consequences after having been accused of such, and even after being exonerated, he still had to fight to get his name back and his reputation back. And of course, once those allegations are leveled, once that's placed upon you, it's hard to come back from that. And yet we're told women never lie about these things. It never happens, has never happened. And yet this is but one example out of many that could be named, and out of many that could be named simply in the last 5 years, where a man's life was ruined on the word of a woman. This is why so many MGTOW have gone monk. This is why so many MGTOW have stuck to traditional pornography, but this is also why the sex doll thing has really taken off, particularly in this community, because it's simply too dangerous to even have a casual relationship with a woman. It's no longer dangerous to simply get married. You're no longer just risking when you say I do, but any time that you're with a woman, and particularly a woman when it's just you and her, you're risking your very life, your very reputation, your very freedom. Now, one of the more recent things that I saw, and I'm not surprised by this at all, was where Alyssa Milano went from believe all women to let's give Joe Biden due process. You know, when Brett Kavanaugh was accused of all this wrongdoing 30 years ago, for which there was no evidence, no proof, and we were just supposed to believe whatever a woman says. Now that Alyssa Milano's presidential candidate is being scrutinized for some of his past decisions and actions, now it's time to, well, hold on just a minute. I know I said believe all women, but now she's going from that to believe some women some of the time. Again, no consistency here. This is what solipsism is all about. Whatever is fitting and beneficial at that particular point in time. Another example of consistency not existing in the female mind. I saw a video clip it's probably been a year or so ago, and I've been meaning to comment on it for quite some time, but you know, as I do videos, I get different ideas here and there, and it's kind of hard to work certain ideas into certain videos. But in this video, a lesbian feminist was talking to Tucker Carlson, who's a conservative, and she was complaining about their spaces being invaded, and that she was upset, and other feminists were upset that their spaces are being eradicated due to the trans movement, due to so-called transgendered women coming into their movement, and them ostensibly having to let them in the movement for fear of being called bigots and not politically correct. Now, feminism has made inroads into male spaces for years. In fact, it wasn't but a few years ago that the Boy Scouts of America have now simply become the Scouts. And there was no outcry from anybody about male spaces, and particularly a space for young men, being done away with and eradicated. And yet, now that inroads are being made into women's spaces, suddenly it's an issue. Another news story from a while back. A young man had declined to wrestle a girl in a high school wrestling tournament or whatever. There were many reasons why he declined. I think one of the reasons he cited was due to some kind of religious reason. But when you really get down to the nitty gritty of it, what did he stand to gain? If he beats her, he gets accused of beating up on women. If he loses his pride. You got beat by a girl. So the guy did the right thing by not putting himself in this untenable position. And people lost their minds over it. How dare he make a decision? How dare he take a stand? And yet these same people are upset that so-called trans women are beating them in their cycling competitions and beating them in their weightlifting competitions and more or less routing them in every single category of women's sports. They throw a fit when that occurs. This is sort of more recent, the recent passing of Kobe Bryant. And I remember several years ago when he was accused of rape. And at the time, I wasn't in the MGTOW knowledge. I hadn't taken the red pill. So it didn't really occur to me then. But the reality of it is if you go back and read the story, you're talking about a Chad type person. He's got the looks, he's got the status, and he's got the money. And I guess he slept with like a hotel maid or something like that. He was never charged criminally with anything. And in fact, the only thing that ended up occurring was there was a civil suit against him, and she won a rather sizable amount of money. And you think about it, she got to get with the Chad, and then she got a payoff when it was all over. Another sort of recent thing, Janie Lane from the band Warrant. I had read an article on him not too long ago where his ex-wife had said that he had told her that he at some point was drugged and raped and that he could have used the MeToo movement. And the thing is that the MeToo movement would have done nothing for him. I mean, look at the Asia Argento situation where she had gotten with an underage male. The MeToo movement did not care about that, and the MeToo movement would not have cared about Janie Lane, or any man for that matter. Another instance of jamming the signal. The Girls Do Porn lawsuit. Essentially, this boils down to girls showed up for what they were told was a clothed modeling gig, and then later got there to find out that they would have to appear naked if they wanted to be paid. But the people doing this, or the people putting this on, assured them that none of this would appear on the internet, And a judge ended up ruling in their favor because I guess he felt like, or she felt like, they pulled the old switcheroo on them. They were coerced, was what the article said that I read. They were told that these images and things would not appear on the internet, but rather would be burned to DVDs for private collectors. And the thought never occurred to them that even if that was the case, that these private collectors wouldn't put the images and videos on the internet themselves. Folks, this isn't coercion. This is just people being stupid. I mean, what do you think is going to happen when you show up, you pose nude for images and videos, and they are relinquished to some third party? There's no coercion here. There's no switcheroo. These ladies made a choice. They were paid for it, and they should have to live with the consequences of their decisions and actions. But the court felt differently. Another story, Gary Danielson. Evidently, this guy's some kind of a sportscaster. Anyway, a few months back or so, a player had went off the sidelines and knocked over a female photographer, and I guess she was somewhat injured. It didn't really go into a whole lot of detail. I mean, I think she might have been hurt, but not to the degree of, needing hospitalization or anything. Apparently, Gary Danielson found this to be funny. And because he found it to be funny, he was lambasted, and there were calls for his head and his job. And yet men have had to endure a decade of watching other men getting hit in the balls on America's Funniest Home Videos, and it's just supposed to be the funniest thing in the world. Another example, John Martin Hill of Match.com. The article said he deceived and scammed women out of money, and he was prosecuted. Now, these women in many cases went willingly to the bank and gave him the money. So, is it really a scam? And many of us can think of the thousands, and maybe in some cases millions if you've been divorced, of money that have been scammed out of us over the years through dinner dates, divorces, child support, alimony. When I say child support, I don't mean that a man shouldn't have to support his child, but we all know that the majority of that money doesn't go to support the children. It goes to get hair done. It goes to get nails done. It goes to pay for jewelry. It goes to, pay for new clothing. And just the countless times that men have been scammed out of money by women on these dates and everything else. The inequity that men have had to face, the amount of money they've been scammed out of in order to go to family court so that they can see their own children. And then the most recent one that I've been seeing bandied about was the Adele divorce. Now, this has happened before. She's not the first one, but there have been instances where the shoe has been on the other foot and the woman's had to pay. And I think Tom Arnold was one of the ones that came to mind most recently. But people are furious and in an uproar over this. And yet this is the everyday reality for most men who are drugged through the divorce and family court cleaners. Another example, Judge Don Gentry, a family court judge, suspended with pay over sexual misconduct allegations, the allegations being having sex with staff in the courthouse, abuse of power to solicit sex and campaign donations from staff members and attorneys, and threats of retaliation if they refused to comply with her demands. Now, if this had been a man, he probably wouldn't have been suspended with pay. He probably would have just been fired, over and done with, finito. And so these are but a few examples of the disparity of treatment and the gynocentrism that really does exist in our society. And these are just a few. There's many, many others. If you wanted to comb through articles just from the past 10 years, you can see that the treatment is not the same. And that's just stuff that's in the media. Obviously they don't point all this stuff out. When you read these articles and things, they don't flesh any of it out or put it into context, with things as a whole. They're just reporting on a story, but they don't see the red pill that's there. Or rather, if they do see it, they make sure that nobody else does. And so that's how you know that the conclusions you've come to, the truths that you have found are indeed true. And that you're not just crazy. And in fact, you're not the only one. There are many other out there who have found the red pill. And the thing is once you've found the red pill, once you've taken the red pill and you see reality for what it is, you see what's really going on in society, it's only natural that you would want to protect yourself. It's only natural that you would have a self-preservation reaction to all these things. And essentially, that's what we're doing by going our own way. We know society doesn't care for us. We know society doesn't have our best interest in mind. In fact, many of us who have friends and family, many of those individuals don't have our best interest in mind. Sometimes you are the only person that is really worried and concerned about you and that has your best interests in the number one slot. Now, it's not always true, and I'm not saying be paranoid, and I'm not saying don't trust anybody. I'm simply saying don't be surprised when you get asked to make decisions or you get asked to do things that go against your own self-interest and what's best for you. Because ultimately, that's what society is really saying. That's why they're so against MGTOW. Because MGTOW is saying, do what is best for you. Do what is right for you. And society wants the exact opposite. Because you're not benefiting society if you're benefiting yourself. So they have to put out all this stuff about how you need to do this and you need to do that. But every once in a while, there's a jamming of the signal and some things get through on the broadcast. And you wake up and you realize that at the end of the day, you might be the only one who really cares about you. Guys, that's all I've got for today. Remember, go your own way or don't. The choice is yours.